A brief examination of Jesus' post-resurrection accounts of Jesus' appearances after his resurrection. By C.M. Noon Introduction. Now, I don't want anyone to think that it's bashing Jesus time. It's not. All I'm doing is exposing the falsehood behind a religion that has doomed us forever. When we die and crossed over, and you are there standing looking for your Savior, Jesus, Brahma, or whomever it is won't be there to accept you. Only the false gods who has duped you into believing in them as being the Creator, as stated earlier. And the purpose is to gain your soul when you die. So no, this is not Jesus bashing, it's the truth. Analyzing the inconsistencies. The accounts of Jesus' appearances after his resurrection vary significantly across different New Testament sources, including Paul's letters, the four Gospels, and other early Christian writings. These differences manifest in timing, location, the nature of the appearances, and theological emphasis. This article critically examines these accounts, highlighting contradictions and inconsistencies that challenge the historical reliability of the resurrection narrative. Chronological table of Jesus' alleged appearances, key contradictions and inconsistencies. 1. Timing discrepancies. Paul and Matthew place Jesus' appearances in Galilee and imply they occurred weeks after the crucifixion. Luke and John focus on immediate appearances in Jerusalem, starting the same day the tomb was found empty. Mark's short ending does not include any post-resurrection appearances at all, ending with the women fleeing the tomb in silence. These inconsistencies suggest later theological modifications rather than consistent historical reporting. 2. Location contradictions. Galilee, Matthew, places Jesus' appearances far from the site of crucifixion, emphasizing uncertainty and a visionary nature. Jerusalem, Luke, John, contradicts earlier accounts, presenting Jesus as appearing immediately and physically near the tomb. Mark, short ending, omits appearances altogether, leaving the resurrection event open-ended. If the resurrection were a historical event, why do the Gospels provide contradictory locations? 3. Nature of the appearances. Paul's account, 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, describes post-resurrection appearances as visionary, undermining the later emphasis on physicality. Mark, short ending, does not record any appearances, leaving the resurrection ambiguous. Matthew suggests a more spiritual or metaphorical experience, with some disciples doubting. Luke and John stress the physicality of Jesus' resurrection, depicting him eating and allowing physical contact, likely a later apologetic development. These differences indicate an evolving narrative rather than a consistent eyewitness testimony. 4. Narrative evolution and theological motivations. Mark's short ending has no post-resurrection appearances. While earlier accounts, Paul, present the resurrection appearances as distant, visionary, or absent altogether. Later accounts, Matthew, Luke, John, introduce immediate and physical encounters, likely to counter growing skepticism. The transition from spiritual visions, Paul, to tangible encounters, Luke and John, suggests theological adaptation rather than historical reliability. Conclusion. A fabricated or evolving story? The inconsistencies in Jesus' post-resurrection appearances across different sources raise serious doubts about their historical accuracy. The discrepancies in timing, location, and nature of the appearances indicate that the resurrection narrative evolved to address theological concerns rather than document a verifiable event. Mark's short ending is particularly revealing, as it contains no appearances at all, raising questions on the whole resurrection claim. References: Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3-8. The Gospel according to Mark, short ending. The Gospel according to Matthew. The Gospel according to Luke. The Gospel according to John. Furthermore, the inconsistencies within the Bible's New Testament stories about the resurrection of Jesus gets more profound. The messages given seem to be more fabricated as you read through each chapter concerning the so-called resurrection. It clearly paints a different picture about the Messiah of Christianity and his life. The Bible is deeply conflicted about how long Jesus remained on earth after his alleged resurrection. Jesus remained on earth anywhere from a few hours after his resurrection, Luke, to 40 days, Acts. To make things even weirder, Luke and Acts were written by the same author. How do we explain such a wild, irreconcilable contradiction? Clearly, the Acts account of the Ascension was forged by someone other than the author of Luke. And hold on to your hats. Now, as stated, the Bible has 7 accounts of the resurrection, and they all disagree irreconcilably. What happened after the alleged resurrection of Jesus? I just wanted to go over this again with you all and give a little more insight into the resurrection. Please note how the number of witnesses keeps growing, from 0 to 513 or more. According to the original Gospel of Mark, which ended at Mark 16:8, no one saw or spoke to Jesus after the empty grave was discovered, because the women told no one about the empty grave. There was no ascension and no sermon preaching angels. How many people saw Jesus? 0. According to John, the last time Jesus was seen was in Galilee, where he had a fish breakfast with 7 disciples who had returned to their careers as fishermen. Only John reports the fishing expedition, which appears to be a forgery, added in order to rehabilitate Peter's reputation after the original author of John savaged it. There was no ascension and no sermon preaching angels. Only John has doubting Thomas, not being at the first appearance of the resurrected Jesus, requiring a second appearance. How many people saw Jesus? 12, including Mary Magdalene. According to Matthew, the last time Jesus was seen was on a mountain in Galilee. There was no ascension and no sermon preaching angels. Matthew said some doubted, which could not have been the case if Jesus had allowed people to touch him, then ascended into the clouds like Superman, with angels preaching a sermon. How many people saw Jesus? 13, including the 2 Marys. According to Luke, Jesus ascended to heaven from Bethany on the evening of the day of his resurrection. There was no crowd of witnesses, just his disciples, and no sermon preaching angels. How many people saw Jesus? 12 or 13, depending on the identity of the unnamed disciple on the road to Emmaus. According to the forged longer ending of Mark, snake charmer Jesus had no better advice for his disciples than to tout the evangelical advantages of drinking poison and handling venomous snakes. There was no crowd of witnesses and no sermon preaching angels. How many people saw Jesus? 12 to 14, including Mary Magdalene, and depending on the identities of 2 unnamed disciples who were walking in the country. According to Acts 1, 3 to 12, Jesus remained in Jerusalem for the biblical 40 days before he ascended to heaven, before a crowd of up to 100 witnesses from Mount Olivet, with 2 angels preaching a sermon. This is an obvious forgery because the original author, who also wrote Luke, knew nothing about any of this nonsense, nor did any other writer of the Bible, suggesting it was a very late forgery. How many people saw Jesus? Around 100. According to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 to 8, the 12 saw the resurrected Jesus. So Judas Iscariot was still alive, and still a disciple. Please note that Judas's death is not mentioned in Mark, Luke, or John, and that the accounts in Matthew and Acts are completely contradictory. There was no ascension and no sermon preaching angels. How many people saw Jesus? 513 or more. These 7 completely contradictory accounts cannot be reconciled. Why? Because, as the author of Mark admitted in the first Gospel, no one saw or spoke to Jesus after his alleged resurrection, so there was no evidence and no eyewitnesses. All made-up events. And with that, I shall leave you with Shalom, NRN3 CM Noon.